I'll snap your arm. My brother-in-law sneered, tossing a pair of heavy MMA gloves at my feet. The metallic thud echoed in the living room, followed by the sound of my 6-year-old daughter sobbing behind me. He stood there, flexing, confidently threatening to hospitalize me in my own home. He looked at me and saw exactly what he wanted to see. A weak, single mother grieving the recent loss of her sister, completely defenseless. He thought this was going to be an easy victory. He thought he could bully me into signing over the family inheritance. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that the woman standing in front of him wasn't just a mother. He had no clue he had just woken up a highly trained combat veteran and a special operations major. And his countdown to a very painful reality check had just begun. My name is Maya Bennett, and at 28 years old, my life has been defined by two completely different worlds. To the outside world, and especially to my family, I was just a quiet woman trying to pick up the pieces after a devastating loss. My sister Clara had passed away just 3 months prior, leaving a massive void in our lives. Since her departure, my entire universe had shrunk down to the walls of our family home and the safety of my 6-year-old daughter Lily. Every morning I woke up with the sole mission of making sure Lily felt secure, loved, and protected from the harsh realities of the grief that hung over us. I spent my days packing school lunches, reading bedtime stories, and speaking in the soft, patient tones of a comforting mother. To anyone looking through the window, I was vulnerable. A single mom carrying the heavy weight of sorrow, seemingly alone and easily overwhelmed by the practical demands of settling in a state. But there was another side to me, a side that was entirely hidden from the neighborhood and the rest of my family. I was currently on an extended personal leave, but my true title was Major Maya Bennett, an active duty officer in the United States Army Special Operations. For nearly a decade, my life had not been about quiet suburbs or domestic routines. It had been about high-stakes environments, intense physical discipline, and mastering the psychological art of staying absolutely calm under extreme pressure. I had undergone some of the most rigorous tactical training imaginable, learning how to read a room in seconds, anticipate threats before they materialized, and defuse dangerous situations with precise efficiency. In my line of work, panic was a luxury that cost lives, so I had trained my mind to become incredibly sharp when things around me started to unravel. Yet when I came home to care for Lily, I deliberately left that uniform in the closet. I didn't want my daughter growing up around the cold, analytical edge of a soldier. I wanted her to have the warmth of a mother. Because of this, I deliberately adopted a gentle, unassuming presence. I wore simple clothes, kept my voice low, and let others take the lead in casual conversations. Unfortunately, this quiet demeanor was completely misinterpreted by the people around me. They didn't see it as a conscious choice of emotional restraint. They saw it as weakness. They assumed that because I didn't argue I couldn't. They assumed that because I was grieving I was helpless. As the weeks ticked by, the legal paperwork regarding the family home and the small business Clara had left behind began to pile up on the dining room table. I knew the local laws and I knew exactly what Clara's wishes were, but I was taking my time, prioritizing Lily's emotional healing over financial technicalities. I wanted the transition to be peaceful. Little did I know my silence was being watched from afar, viewed as a perfect window of opportunity. A dark storm was quietly gathering just outside our sanctuary, driven by someone who saw my grief not as a tragedy to be respected, but as a weakness to be exploited. I was about to find out exactly how far human greed could go, and just how deeply someone could underestimate a woman simply because she chose to be gentle. The quiet sanctuary I had worked so hard to maintain for Lily was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. The rain was tapping softly against the living room windows, and Lily was sitting on the rug, deeply focused on drawing a picture of a bright green garden. The peaceful atmosphere disappeared the moment a heavy, demanding knock echoed through the front door. It wasn't the polite rhythm of a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was a loud, aggressive pounding that immediately made Lily flinch and look up at me with wide, anxious eyes. I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, giving her a gentle smile to keep her calm, before standing up and walking toward the foyer. When I opened the door, the damp air rushed inside, accompanied by the towering, imposing figure of my brother-in-law, Marcus. Marcus didn't wait to be invited. He stepped right past me into the hallway, shaking the water off his expensive leather jacket as if he owned the place. He was a tall man, heavily built, with a sharp, arrogant jawline and eyes that constantly scanned the room like he was calculating the monetary value of everything he looked at. Ever since my sister Clara passed away, Marcus had treated her absence not with sorrow, but with a strange, frantic energy. He was a man driven entirely by appearance and material success, always talking about his next big business venture, though anyone paying close attention could see the cracks in his wealthy facade. Today his presence felt especially intense, radiating a cold, calculated authority that filled the small hallway. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and soft, maintaining the gentle persona he was accustomed to. "I wasn't expecting you today. Lily is just finishing up some drawings in the other room." He didn't look at me, instead walking straight toward the dining room where the stacks of estate documents were kept. "We don't have time for pleasantries, Maya," he said, his tone carrying a harsh, patronizing edge that made my inner alarms trigger. "This situation with Clara's estate has dragged on long enough. You've been sitting on these papers for weeks, acting like the world has stopped moving. I'm here to put an end to the delays." He threw a thick folder down onto the dining table, the heavy thud drawing Lily's attention from the next room. I watched him closely, my mind immediately shifting into an analytical mode, noting the tension in his shoulders and the slight tremor in his hands. He was desperate, hiding it behind a wall of pure arrogance. He looked down at me, his eyes filled with a dismissive certainty. To him, I was just a grieving, overwhelmed single mother who didn't understand finances or legalities. A soft target he could easily push around to get exactly what he wanted. "I need you to sign the transfer protocols today," Marcus continued, leaning forward to loom over me, using his physical size as an obvious tactic to intimidate. "The business, the properties, everything needs to be consolidated under my name so I can manage the liquidation. You clearly can't handle this responsibility, Maya. You're drowning, and it's time to let a real professional take control before you lose what little is left." He stared at me, waiting for the tears or the submission he fully expected to see on my face. Marcus stood there, towering over me, entirely convinced that his physical presence was enough to make me fold. As he waited for a response, my mind completely detached from the tension in the dining room and drifted back to a world he knew absolutely nothing about. I thought about the grueling years I had spent earned my rank, enduring the unforgiving environments that forge a special operations officer. Marcus thought he knew what pressure felt like because he managed business deals, but he had never experienced the true definition of extreme stress. He had never stood on a rain-drenched tarmac in the dead of night, checking tactical gear while the hum of a military transport engine vibrated through his bones. He had never been responsible for the lives of an elite team, navigating complex, high-stakes operations where a single miscalculation meant absolute disaster. My training had begun in the dirt and the mud, pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. I remembered the endless weeks of survival training, where sleep was a luxury and physical exhaustion was a constant state of being. They taught us how to compartmentalize physical pain, how to quiet the natural instinct to panic, and how to laser focus our minds when everything around us was descending into chaos. In special ops, you learn that your greatest weapon isn't the firearm at your hip or the combative techniques dialed into your muscle memory. It is your mind. You learn to analyze a threat with cold, mathematical precision, separating your emotions entirely from the reality of the situation. I had spent nearly a decade mastering hand-to-hand combat, tactical negotiation, and threat assessment, earning the respect of some of the toughest soldiers in the world. When Marcus looked at me, he saw a quiet woman wearing an oversized sweater, completely oblivious to the fact that every single movement I made was deliberate. As a major, I had commanded respect not through loud, empty threats, but through unshakable competence and strategic brilliance. I knew exactly how to dismantle an opponent's confidence without ever raising my voice. I knew how to wait, how to gather intelligence, and how to strike only when the timing was mathematically perfect. This hidden history was the foundation of my current calm. The discipline, the tactical mindset, and the absolute lack of fear weren't gone. They were simply resting beneath the surface, protected by the quiet domestic life I had chosen for my daughter. Marcus believed he was stepping into a cage with a defenseless lamb, completely unaware that he had just walked into the crosshairs of a seasoned operative who was simply measuring his weaknesses. The tension in the dining room snapped instantly as Marcus realized his verbal intimidation wasn't yielding the quick compliance he desired. His face darkened, the patronizing arrogance shifting into a cold, aggressive desperation. He unzipped his heavy bag and pulled out a pair of heavy, worn MMA gloves, tossing them brutally onto the table. The metallic thud echoed sharply through the open space, immediately causing Lily to let out a small, terrified sob from the living room rug. Marcus stepped closer, his shadow completely blocking out the dim afternoon light, and pointed a finger directly at my face, dropping all pretense of family harmony. "I am completely done playing nice with you, Maya," he sneered, his voice laced with an intense, vicious malice that filled the room. "Look at you sitting here acting like you have a choice. If you don't sign these estate papers right now, I will personally make sure you end up in a hospital bed. I will snap your arm like a twig, and I don't care if your little girl has to watch it happen. You are weak, you are completely alone, and nobody is coming to save you from me." I heard Lily scramble up from the floor, running to hide behind my legs, her tiny hands gripping the fabric of my sweater as she wept silently in absolute terror. Marcus looked down at her, then back up at me, a cruel, victorious smile spreading across his face as he enjoyed the fear he was causing. He truly believed that threatening physical violence against a single mother in front of her child was his ultimate winning move. He expected me to scream, to beg, or to immediately reach for the pen to save myself from his wrath. He had absolutely no idea that his vicious words hadn't terrified me. They had simply reawakened a highly trained operative, and transitioned him from a family nuisance into a hostile target. Hearing my daughter sob behind my legs changed everything. While Marcus stood there flexing his jaw, trying to use his size to paralyze me with fear, my special operations training took over instantly. My heart rate didn't spike and my breathing remained perfectly rhythmic and deep. In my mind, the emotional weight of the room vanished, replaced by the cold, analytical grid of a tactical threat assessment. I looked at Marcus not as a terrifying brother-in-law, but as an erratic, untrained hostile who had just compromised his own stance. He was leaning too far forward, his weight unevenly distributed, driven entirely by blind adrenaline and unchecked arrogance. He was completely open, leaving himself exposed to half a dozen immediate counterstrikes if I chose to neutralize him right then and there. But my primary objective wasn't to engage, it was to secure the asset, my daughter. Without breaking eye contact with Marcus, I reached down, my hands steady and warm, and gently guided Lily further back toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. "Lily, sweetie, go into your room and close the door for just a few minutes," I said, my voice completely smooth, calm, and entirely devoid of fear. The absolute certainty in my tone acted like a shield, instantly lowering her panic. She looked up at my face, saw that I wasn't shaking, nodded quickly, and ran down the hall, clicking her door shut behind her. Now the room was clear. The distraction was gone. I turned my full attention back to Marcus, stepping into the center of the room to command the space. I deliberately kept my posture relaxed, my hands open and visible at my sides. A classic de-escalation stance that looked submissive to an amateur, but allowed me to strike or defend in a fraction of a second. I needed to gather more intelligence on what exactly he was trying to force me to sign before I shut this operation down completely. "Let's take a breath, Marcus," I said softly, letting him believe his intimidation tactic had worked just enough to keep him talking. Marcus mistook my calm demeanor for absolute submission. A smug, self-satisfied grin spread across his face as he reached down and tapped the thick manila folder resting on the dining table. To him, the fight was already won. He pulled out the documents with a theatrical flourish, sliding them across the dark wood toward me along with a heavy black pen. I looked down at the pages, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with the practiced efficiency of a military intelligence officer. I wasn't just reading the words, I was decoding the true objective of his mission. The paperwork was incredibly aggressive. It wasn't a standard probate agreement or a temporary management contract. It was an absolute, unconditional transfer of all rights, titles, and interests regarding Clara's entire estate. If I signed these papers, I would be voluntarily signing away the primary residence, the Lake Tahoe property, and every single liquid asset connected to the family business. It even contained a clause that legally absolved Marcus of any financial liability or future accountability regarding how the funds were distributed. It was a complete legal trap, designed to strip Lily and me of our entire financial security in a single afternoon, leaving us entirely at his mercy. "It's very simple, Maya," Marcus said, his voice dripping with a smooth, patronizing confidence as he leaned against the edge of the desk. You sign the bottom of each page and I take care of the rest. I'll handle the liquidations, the corporate restructuring, and all the boring legal details that are clearly giving you a headache. You won't have to worry about a single thing anymore. I'll even let you stay in the house for a couple of months while you figure out your next steps. I'm being incredibly generous here. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, letting a subtle hint of hesitation show on my face to keep him in his comfort zone. I picked up the pen, rolling it slowly between my fingers as if I were genuinely contemplating my signature. In reality, I was committing every detail of the document to memory, analyzing the legal loopholes he had attempted to construct. I needed him to believe that his pressure tactic was succeeding so he would lower his guard completely. The longer he believed I was a defenseless target, the more information he would willingly expose. "This is a massive decision, Marcus," I said softly, looking up at him through lowered eyelashes, perfectly playing the part of the overwhelmed single mother. "There are a lot of moving parts here. I just want to make absolutely sure that Clara's wishes are being respected and that Lily's future is fully secure before I put my name on anything permanent." Marcus laughed, a loud, dismissive sound that bounced off the walls of the quiet dining room. "Clara's wishes don't matter anymore, Maya. Reality matters. And the reality is that you don't have the strength or the expertise to run a business or manage these properties. You're just a grieving widow's sister trying to play house. Sign the papers, let the professionals handle the real work, and let's get this over with today." He tapped his finger against the signature line, his arrogance reaching its absolute peak, completely oblivious to the fact that he was handing me the exact legal ammunition I needed to destroy him. "I need a moment to think this through," I said quietly, setting the pen down on the table. Marcus rolled his eyes and checked his watch, pacing back into the living room with a heavy sigh. "5 minutes, Maya. Don't make me lose my patience again." I used that exact window of time to walk into the kitchen out of his direct line of sight and pulled out my phone. I didn't call a standard family lawyer. Instead, I dialed a secure line to a trusted military legal advocate I had worked with during my time in the service. When the advocate answered, I quickly explained the situation, keeping my voice down to a sharp whisper. I read off the specific corporate names and account details listed on the paperwork Marcus had brought into my home. "In the military, we don't operate on guesswork. We operate on verifiable intelligence, and I needed to know exactly what kind of adversary I was dealing with." Within minutes, the advocate ran a comprehensive check through official channels and uncovered the ugly truth behind Marcus's sudden urgency. Marcus was drowning. The high-rolling businessman facade he presented to the world was an absolute lie. His personal consulting firm was facing multiple lawsuits for fraud, and he had accumulated massive debts that were rapidly coming due. He wasn't trying to manage my sister's estate out of a sense of family duty. He was trying to liquidate our family assets immediately to pay off his own aggressive creditors before his entire life collapsed. Armed with this new data, I forgot the pen, the quiet, gentle expression returning to my face as I walked back into the dining room. Marcus was waiting, tapping his foot impatiently, completely unaware that the tactical balance of power had just shifted entirely out of his hands. Marcus checked his watch again, his frustration visibly mounting as he paced back toward the dining table. Before he could speak, the heavy front door clicked open and a second man stepped into the hallway. He was younger, stocky, built like a brick wall, and wore a menacing expression that matched the cold energy Marcus had brought into the house. Marcus didn't look surprised. In fact, a triumphant smirk returned to his face as he gestured toward his associate. This was exactly what I had trained for. An escalating scenario involving multiple hostile actors moving into a confined domestic space. "This is Vince," Marcus said, his voice flat and entirely stripped of any remaining familial warmth. "He handles security and asset enforcement for my business ventures. I brought him along because I knew you might try to be stubborn, Maya. I told you earlier that your time was up and I meant it. Vince doesn't have the patience that I do, and he certainly doesn't care about your grief or your sister's memory." Vince stepped forward, deliberately crossing his arms and planting his feet firmly on the hardwood floor, effectively blocking the path to the front door. The two of them stood side by side, creating a physical barrier, attempting to use basic psychological crowding to make the room feel small and suffocating. They expected me to shrink back, to look around frantically for an escape route, or to show the classic signs of a cornered, defenseless target trapped in her own home. Instead, I stood perfectly still, my muscles completely loose and ready, my eyes calmly taking in every detail of their positioning. I noted their spacing, their balance points, and how their shadows stretched across the room. They had successfully surrounded me, but in doing so, they had walked directly into an enclosed tactical environment where their size meant absolutely nothing against precise, specialized training. "Maya, this is your very last chance to make this easy for yourself," Marcus stated, leaning against the table, completely confident that the presence of his enforcer would finally break my resolve. "Sign the papers right now or Vince and I will take what we came for and the consequences for you will be severe. Nobody knows we're here and nobody is going to come protect you." They stood waiting, utterly oblivious to the fact that they weren't cornering a victim. They were standing in a trap engineered by a special ops major. The air in the room grew completely still. Marcus and Vince stood side by side, their postures rigid with the expectation of an easy surrender. They were waiting for me to break, fully convinced that their physical presence had backed me into a corner. But as Vince took a heavy step forward, his hand reaching out aggressively to grab my shoulder, my body reacted with the fluid, instantaneous precision that years of elite special operations drilling had made second nature. I didn't flinch and I didn't retreat. Instead, I stepped inside his reach, utilizing his own forward momentum against him. With a swift, non-lethal redirection, I caught his wrist, pivoting my hips to completely compromise his balance. Before he could comprehend the sudden shift in weight, I applied a precise joint lock, using leverage rather than brute strength to force his arm behind his back. The stocky enforcer gasped in sheer shock as he was instantly brought to his knees, his forehead pressed firmly against the cool hardwood floor, entirely immobilized and unable to break free from the hold. Marcus froze, his mouth falling open as the smug expression vanished from his face in a fraction of a second. He looked down at his enforcer, then up at me, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. The quiet, fragile sister-in-law he thought he could easily bully had just neutralized a grown man twice her size without even breaking a sweat or raising her voice. I kept my grip perfectly secure, my breathing entirely controlled, looking directly into Marcus's panicked eyes with the unshakable authority of a commanding officer who had just taken total control of the battlefield. I released my grip on Vince, stepping back seamlessly as he scrambled to his feet, holding his arm and backing away toward the door. The aggressive confidence that had filled the room just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a thick, heavy silence. Marcus stared at me, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to find words to process what he had just witnessed. He looked at the paperwork on the table, then back at me, realizing the entire dynamic had changed. What are you?" Marcus stammered, his voice losing all its deep, commanding resonance, sounding small and hollow in the quiet dining room. I stood tall, shoulders squared, adopting the exact posture I used when addressing a platoon. "My name is Major Maya Bennett, Marcus," I said, my voice carrying a cold, military authority that made him visibly flinch. "I am an active-duty officer in the United States Army Special Operations. The woman you thought you were dealing with doesn't exist. I have spent nearly a decade operating in environments you couldn't possibly survive, and I am certainly not intimidated by a broken businessman throwing temper tantrums in my home." Before he could speak, I reached into my sweater pocket, pulled out the phone and pulled up the secure file my legal advocate had just sent over. I laid the screen flat on the table right next to his fraudulent paperwork. "You thought you came here to corner me, but you walked right into an intelligence trap. I know about the lawsuits against your firm. I know about the embezzlement from your clients, and I have the full transactional history of your fraudulent attempts to liquidate my sister's estate to cover your debts." Marcus looked down at the screen, his face draining of whatever color was left. The legal documents displayed were official, verified, and completely undeniable. The entire narrative he had constructed to steal our family's security had been dismantled in less than 20 minutes. He was no longer a powerful enforcement figure. He was just a desperate man caught red-handed in a series of severe federal crimes. "You're going to listen to me very carefully now," I continued, leaning in just enough to look directly into his panicked eyes. "The game is over. You are going to sit down, you are going to keep your hands on the table, and you are going to wait quietly while the proper authorities arrive to handle this situation legally. If either of you makes a single movement toward the door or toward me, I will consider it a hostile action, and I will neutralize the threat permanently. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded rapidly, completely broken, sitting down heavily in the nearest chair as Vince stood frozen by the wall. The minutes ticked by in absolute silence as Marcus and Vince sat motionless under my watchful eye. The loud, demanding bullies who had barged into my home were completely gone, replaced by two men who looked terrified to even shift in their seats. I stood near the doorway, keeping a tactical view of both hostels and the hallway where Lily was safely waiting. The tension in the air was thick, but it was a tension I controlled entirely. Exactly 20 minutes after I made the call, the quiet neighborhood street outside came alive with the sound of approaching vehicles. Through the front window, I watched as two local law enforcement cruisers pulled into the driveway, followed closely by a sleek, unmarked black sedan. Marcus looked up sharply, his eyes darting toward the window as the reality of his situation finally settled in. The front door opened and 3 local police officers entered the foyer, led by Captain Miller, a senior military legal representative from my base who had coordinated the response. "Major Bennett," Captain Miller said, stepping into the dining room and offering a crisp nod of respect. "We have the perimeter secured and the warrants processed based on the digital evidence your advocate forwarded. Are you and the assets secure?" "We are secure, Captain," I replied, my voice calm and professional as I stepped aside to let the officers take over the space. "The subjects are cooperative. All the fraudulent documents and the physical evidence are right here on the table." The local officers moved in efficiently, instructing Marcus and Vince to stand up and face the wall. For all his previous threats of violence and hospitalization, Marcus offered absolutely no resistance. His hands shook violently as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He looked over his shoulder at me one last time, his face completely pale, his mouth opening as if to beg for leniency, but the commanding authority in my gaze silenced him before he could speak a single word. Captain Miller gathered the manila folder, the heavy MMA gloves, and the legal printouts from the table, placing them carefully into secure evidence bags. "We'll take it from here, Major," he said, gesturing for the officers to lead the 2 men out into the rain. "The civilian fraud charges are locked down, and the military legal team will ensure the estate protections are enforced immediately." As the flashing red and blue lights faded down the driveway, the heavy shadow that had hung over our home for weeks finally lifted, leaving behind a profound sense of relief. With the house quiet once again, the legal process moved forward with rapid, unstoppable momentum. The files Captain Miller collected were handed over to both state and federal investigators, who quickly realized that the fraud ran far deeper than a simple family dispute. Marcus had built his entire lifestyle on a foundation of deception, and my sister's passing had simply been the catalyst that brought his house of cards crashing down. The investigation revealed a systematic pattern of forgery, unauthorized asset transfers, and deliberate manipulation designed to exploit our family's grief for personal gain. Because Marcus had crossed state lines to execute his plan and utilized digital networks to attempt the fraudulent transfers, the charges quickly escalated to the federal level. The legal advocate I consulted tracked every single account he had touched, ensuring that every piece of evidence was completely airtight. Marcus's high-priced defense attorneys tried to find loopholes, attempting to frame the incident as a family misunderstanding, but the recorded conversations and forensic financial audits left them with absolutely no room to maneuver. His associate, Vince, quickly turned on him, providing detailed testimony about Marcus's operations in exchange for a reduced sentence, which completely sealed his fate. Within weeks, the courts froze all of Marcus's corporate accounts and initiated the liquidation of his personal assets to repay the clients he had defrauded over the years. The grand lifestyle he had flaunted, the expensive cars, the luxury home, the arrogant public persona, was entirely dismantled by the legal system. He went from a man who believed he could dictate the lives of others through fear to a convicted felon facing multiple years in a federal penitentiary. His own unchecked greed and the absolute certainty that he was the smartest person in the room had become his ultimate undoing, proving that no amount of intimidation could withstand the precise force of the law. Once the flashing police lights finally disappeared from the street, the heavy silence that settled over the house felt entirely different. The chaotic energy Marcus had brought into our home was gone, replaced by a profound, clean emptiness. I took a deep, centering breath, letting the rigid posture of a special operations major melt away, and shifted back into the role that mattered most to me. I walked down the quiet hallway, my steps soft on the hardwood floor, and knocked gently on my daughter's bedroom door. "Lily, sweetie, it's Mommy," I said softly. "Everything is okay now." You can come out. The door clicked open and Lily looked up at me, her big brown eyes searching my face for any remaining signs of trouble. When she saw my familiar warm smile, she wrapped her small arms tightly around my waist, burying her face in my sweater. I lifted her up, carrying her back into the living room, deliberately avoiding the dining area where the legal papers had been scattered. I sat with her on the rug right where she had been drawing earlier and pulled her close. We sat there for a long time, just breathing together, letting the safety of our sanctuary wrap around us like a blanket. "Is the mean man gone?" she whispered, her voice still trembling slightly. "He's gone, sweetie. And he's never ever coming back," I promised her, kissing the top of her head. "Mommy took care of it. You are perfectly safe here." For the rest of the afternoon we focused entirely on rebuilding our peace. We gathered her scattered crayons and finished the drawing of the bright green garden she had started before the intrusion. I made her favorite dinner, turned on her favorite animated movie, and let the normal, beautiful rhythms of domestic life fill the rooms once again. Watching her laugh at a silly cartoon character, the tension finally leaving her small shoulders, was the greatest victory I could have ever asked for. The physical defense of our home was over. Now the emotional healing could truly begin. The legal battle reached its absolute conclusion just 2 months later. With the overwhelming evidence provided by the federal investigation, the court stripped Marcus of any remaining legal standing regarding our family's affairs. The judge looked over the comprehensive documentation and issued a permanent, ironclad protective order, ensuring that neither Marcus nor any of his remaining associates could ever step foot near my daughter or me again. The dark cloud of litigation that had threatened to consume our lives was officially cleared away by the stroke of a pen. With the legal threats completely neutralized, I was finally able to honor my sister Clara's true wishes. The family home and the small business assets were securely consolidated and transferred into a locked educational trust designed solely for Lily's future. The properties were completely cleared of any fraudulent liens or financial entanglements Marcus had tried to create. Every single dollar Clara had worked so hard to build was preserved exactly where it belonged, ensuring that Lily would grow up with the ultimate foundation of stability and support. I stood in the clean, quiet dining room one morning, looking at the empty table where the chaotic stacks of paperwork used to sit. The sun was streaming brightly through the clean glass windows, casting warm golden squares across the floor. There were no more court dates, no more midnight phone calls with advocates, and no more hostile confrontations to prepare for. The victory wasn't just about winning a legal case or protecting our finances. It was about reclaiming the absolute right to live our lives in peace, free from the manipulation of greedy people. As I look out the window at Lily playing safely in the yard, I am reminded of the quiet strength that exists inside every mother. The world often misinterprets a gentle spirit as weakness, assuming that those who choose peace are incapable of fighting. Marcus made the mistake of looking at my grief in my quiet home and seeing an easy target. He never understood that the same hands that pack school lunches and wipe away tears are fully capable of standing up against injustice when it counts. True strength doesn't come from loud threats, empty arrogance, or trying to intimidate others. It comes from an unshakable commitment to protecting the people we love and doing what is right. My time in special operations taught me how to face dangerous situations with absolute calm, but my time as a mother taught me what is truly worth fighting for. We all face moments where the world tries to push us around, squeeze us into corners, or make us feel small and powerless. But you are always stronger than you realize, and you possess the capability to rewrite the narrative when people try to underestimate your resolve. Thank you for listening to my journey from the beginning all the way to the end. What would you have done if you found yourself standing in my shoes that afternoon? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below.